Over the past few decades, one of the biggest crises facing the Catholic Church is the shortage of priests. Charts showing the decline in overall numbers of priests and religious, lower enrollment in seminaries, and an increase in the number of parishes without a resident priest make it clear that we have a problem on our hands as a church. And yet much of what we say and believe can actually be a bit misleading. While extensive research has been done in this area and statistics are freely quoted, there remains many commonly held myths about what's going on and what we should do to fix it. This is Catholicism in Focus. The first and most commonly held myth is that the number of vocations to the priesthood is dropping. And looking at a chart like this, showing the US seminary enrollment since 1975, definitely gives that impression. Yet there's something very misleading about it. The lines that show the greatest decline represent high school and college seminarians, programs that were removed by most dioceses not because they couldn't find students, but because they determined them to be ineffective at producing priests. Remove those two lines and what you get is a much more stable picture. Charts like these can also be misleading because they compare today's numbers to a time when we had many more vocations. There is no doubt that there are fewer seminarians now than there were in the 1970s, but what gets lost in this fact is that seminary enrollment and priestly ordinations have actually been growing since the mid-1990s. What's also important to remember is that these numbers, while indicative of many Western countries, do not represent global trends. Since 1980, the world has seen an overall increase in the number of priests, with Africa and Asia doubling in that time. Number 2, the overall drop in vocations is the only factor to this issue. While it is definitely significant that the number of priests has continued to decline since the 1960s, the overall number of Catholics has grown at a fairly constant rate, exacerbating the problem with a greater need. The trend is similar worldwide, showing an increase of nearly 500 million people in 30 years. And although vocations are growing at a faster rate in places like Africa and Asia, there were fewer priests to begin with in those places, meaning that the global ratio of Catholics per priest has risen from 1,895 to 3,126. With such a constant increase, even if the number of vocations had remained at the level that seemed normal in the 1960s, it still would not have been enough to stave off a worldwide shortage. Number 3. Vatican II was responsible for the priest shortage. One of the most misleading aspects of most charts related to the priest shortage is that they begin with the year 1965. The year that Vatican II ended. The problem is that these numbers don't tell the whole story. While the peak of the total number of priests occurred in the 1960s, the peak of vocations occurred long before that. By the start of the council, the boom of the 1930s and 40s had already begun to fade, and the total number of priests had begun to level off. My province of Franciscans is a perfect representation of this trend. In 1965, the same year that the council closed, we reached our high point with 1,022 friars, and have marked a steady decline since then. And yet, when you look at the number of novices, or new members entering each year, we reached our high point just before World War II and began to decline consistently after the war. This example highlights a much more prevalent cultural phenomenon that was underway before and independent of the council. The events of World War II had left a gaping hole in society that would lead to tremendous cultural upheaval, the rise of new atheism, the drop in church attendance across all major denominations, and eventually the major drop-off of new vocations. Add this to the fact that the post-conciliar numbers are very similar to pre-1930s numbers, and it's much more likely to conclude that the number of vocations we experienced in the middle of the century might actually be the outlier, not the norm. Number 4. Allowing married men and women to be ordained would fix the problem. For many, the answer is simple. Stop making the requirements so strict that we exclude loads of capable candidates. And it's true, widening the net to include others would definitely increase the number of priests, lessening the shortage. The reason that this is ultimately a myth, though, is because there is no real evidence to show that this would solve the problem in the long run. When we look to other Christian denominations, we can see a slight downward trend in divinity school enrollment in recent years, even among denominations that allow for married and women clergy. And while some will point to the steady number of permanent deacons being ordained to the church each year, we can assume that a significant amount of these men would choose to be priests if the church were to allow married men to be ordained. The vocation of a deacon is different from that of a priest, and we have to assume that they're pursuing the diaconate because that's their calling. There's also a question of integrity in this issue. If the church believes that married men or women can be ordained, then they should allow it because it's the right thing to do, not because we're desperate. To make a decision simply out of desperation, especially when there's no guarantee of success, does not seem like a good path to take. And finally, number 5. The church is doomed and there's nothing we can do. Given the first 4 myths, we should at this point have a much more grounded perspective on the situation. The shortage is definitely a problem, but we're not facing a doomsday scenario. In fact, a look to history shows that 2012 actually had the same ratio of priests to parish as 1950, a time we would not have considered as a crisis. While modest in some places, vocations are in fact up, and having more Catholics than we've ever had is not a problem we really want to complain about. And even though our world is becoming more secular, with fewer young people considering a life of service in the church, there are still things we can do. One easy step is to simply encourage young people, men and women, to consider a religious vocation. Research shows that one of the most significant factors pursuing a vocation is the encouragement of someone from the community. Too often we forget to ask the question, or worse yet, actually discourage people from thinking about it. Another response we can have is to get involved ourselves. Sure, there may be fewer priests and religious around to lead the church, but really, there are very few things in the life of the church that require a priest. With so many more among the faithful, the life of the church will continue with amazing vigor if everyone would just do what they could do. Lead prayer groups, visit the sick, donate money, volunteer at a soup kitchen, organize the community for social concerns, advocate for issues that matter to us. No amount of priest shortage can stop the faithful from living as disciples of Christ. And maybe that's the positive takeaway from all of this. Having loads of new priests would certainly be a good thing, and we should do everything we can to encourage vocations. But being forced to take responsibility for our own faith and be leaders ourselves is not exactly a bad thing either. In crisis, there are always two options. We can let the negative control us, fold, and give up. Or we can take the opportunity to be resilient, innovative, and make the mission of Christ present through us rather than waiting for someone else to take care of it for us. Do you know someone who might be interested in religious life, priesthood, or dedicated lay leadership in the church? Why don't you encourage them by pointing them to our vocation website, beafranciscan.org, your local diocese, or to any one of my social media outlets where we can connect. One of the major missions here at Breaking the Habit is to provide resources and support for those discerning deeper Christian life, and I'll do anything I can to help in the process.